All right, we're going to call the meeting to order at 6:45. We're going to make a note that we don't have a quorum, so we're going to just skip on to presentations until we do have a quorum and can do the other business things. Oh, we can still do roll call. Ryan would like to do. He enjoys doing that.
Mariam Ar-Rahim. She is. Sarah Balgoyan. Lynn Branham. Sam Bindum. Ellen D. Alex Evans. Amy Felty. David Harbour. Ryan Hughes, here. Artist James. Scott Lerner. Esther Pat. Here. Carolyn Randolph. Here. Henry Ross. Syl Shelton. Susan Silver. Demario Turner. And Gerald Walter. Here. Thank you all.
Well, I'd like to introduce Betsy Clark of the Juvenile Justice Initiative. I've asked her and Susan Whitkin and Karima Douglas that all represent juvenile justice issues in a variety of ways and have some information to share with us on data and recommendations and items that we can think about and consider for tackling our racial disparities in our juvenile justice system as well. And Betsy, if you don't mind pushing the little button there to turn the mic on when you speak, that would be great. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you. I just want to say it's a real honor to be here. I've been working with Sarah for many years. I'm delighted to be here and see familiar faces, and also I went to school here. And as I was driving over, I got this oldie station. It was sort of a trip down memory lane, so thank you for that. I know your time is short. Let me just say that, and I put this all in a PowerPoint so that you can go back and look at this later, but I run the Juvenile Justice Initiative, which was started back in 2000. We work to right-size the juvenile justice system. So we've worked to raise the age of juvenile court, end adult prosecution of children. We've worked to right-size, decrease incarceration. So we were behind Redeploy Illinois, and so we've, through that, been able to close 3 of the 8 juvenile prisons in this state. So, and then we work on fairness issues, counsel for children, and so forth.
I'm just going to make this bigger. If that's
Okay.
with
Oh,
you.
yeah, of course.
There we go. Thanks.
Okay.
And then you can just hit any button to move forward.
Okay. So I'm going to focus this evening on detention because that's been something we've been paying a lot of attention to. The state has paid a lot of attention to the deep end juvenile prison, and we've really reduced the numbers there. But we haven't paid much attention to the front end detention, which is really jail for juveniles. It's pre-trial, and it's the entry to the system. And you have to start with the research, which is absolutely clear that no matter how good or how benign how good your detention program is, detention is harmful. Children perceive it as stigmatizing. The research shows that they are 39 percentage points less likely to graduate from high school. They're 41 percentage points more likely to have entered adult prison by age 25. This is just absolutely across the board. They're also more likely to have psychiatric disorders, behavioral disorders, and children in the premier longitudinal study on the impact of juvenile detention on children that came out of Cook County showed that they have higher mortality rates. It is really sobering, the impact that detention has on children. And there are very few, really, detention centers in this state. There's 16. We're a state of 102 counties, 16 detention centers. Champaign is one of them. Only a quarter of detention admissions, Susan can elaborate on this here and there, I'm loosely using her data, and I hope I'm using it correctly, but only a quarter of the children who are in juvenile detention are in for what are perceived as violent offenses. We really overuse detention. There are profound racial disparities everywhere in the state where detention is used. More than 2/3 of detention admissions statewide were non-white, 59% Black, 12% Hispanic in 2015. And we use it very, very differently in different areas of the state. So Cook County, which has the highest numbers but some of the lowest rates, Cook County is about 40% of the state's population, and so it would have higher numbers than the other counties. But Jefferson County had the state's highest rate of detention in 2015. And Champaign was up there with Peoria, Perry, Vermilion, Champaign, St. Clair, and Sangamon. So that's not a good group to be part of. I said as a state, we've spent a lot of time really reforming our juvenile prison system so that it complies with best practices and research. So the minimum age after you are found guilty to go to juvenile prison is 13. Juvenile prison is limited to felonies. It can only be used if you can document, the judge can document that's the least restrictive alternative and that other options have been explored. We have Redeploy Illinois, and I might add that Champaign has not participated in Redeploy, and that is something I would urge you to reconsider. Redeploy Illinois has helped counties develop alternatives to incarceration. And there's an independent ombudsman who travels around to the 5 remaining, we've closed 3 of the 8 juvenile prisons, to the 5 remaining juvenile prisons, holds restorative justice circles with the kids in the prison, and reports back on the conditions. And none of this is true for pretrial detention. Pretrial detention, the minimum age is 10. Misdemeanors are okay. There's no independent oversight. It can be used in any case of what's perceived as immediate and urgent necessity. There's no redeploy program for detention. And as a result, state funding for the juvenile prisons is decreasing. The director of the juvenile prisons came in to the appropriations hearing this year, and she said, I'm asking for less than I did last year. But state funding for staff through the court budget to counties for detention is increasing every year. So most counties rarely use detention. Again, just so you know, it's very disparate across the state. 69 counties actually had 30 or fewer admissions in 2015. Only 12 counties had 200 or more detention admissions. But the top users of detention then tend to be the top committers to state juvenile prison. Once you're in, you're more likely to go deeper. And Champaign was in 2016 the 3rd highest committer to state juvenile prison. And number 10 in detention admissions. Champaign is always up there in the top 10. Again, not a group you want to be part of. And Cook's numbers need to go down. There's no question about it. And Cook County is not part of Redeploy Illinois either and should be. But I just want to point out that if you add up Winnebago, Champaign, Sangamon, Peoria, there's 17% of the population of Cook, but the commitments to state juvenile prison are about half that of Cook. So the rates are much higher. There are state dollars to reimburse detention center staff, and they are significant. What troubles me about this, among many things that trouble me about this, and these numbers keep going up every year, these are for staff working in the detention centers. There aren't comparable dollars to juvenile defenders to represent children at hearings to see if detention is appropriate. And that's something where when we do get a state budget, and I hope in my lifetime we will get a state budget again, I think that the issue of juvenile defense is really critical for the counties to look at and to stop carrying the burden of defense services. It really should be a unified statewide system as it is in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa. We could then have adequately trained and resourced defenders to keep children out of detention. And your money should be going to keep kids out to defense services, not to detention staff to keep them locked up. So we need to shift our state resources, and legislators are beginning to look at this for the first time, which is good. Just want to make the point that Redeploy Illinois is modest funding for community alternatives to decrease commitments to state juvenile prison. You get with that support such as training, technical assistance, all-site meetings. I know that you have participated in some of the planning grants, and I hope that you'll insist that your county go further. And I want to show you these trends that while detention has been decreasing, but not as quickly as post-trial incarceration has been decreasing. And you can see that with these numbers. But again, Susan's going to explain that further. Let me move on here. I don't often use Cook County as an example here, but in terms of detention, Cook County is a good example to begin looking at. They have accomplished an incredible decrease in detention admissions. There was a point when I started practicing with the public defender office in Cook County where they were 800 kids in the detention center, sleeping kids on cots in the day room. They're down now to under 300 children in that detention center, and they've done it by being very, very intentional. And every other county should be looking at their processes and following that. And as a result, they've gone from 54% of the state's detention admissions to 31%. And arrest rates have gone down throughout this time as well. The way they've done it is the screening instrument. The key to children going into detention is your screening instrument. And I haven't seen yours, but I've seen Cook's. And the key to that, you should insist on examining that. The probation controls that, and the idea is that it should only include objective factors. So if that screening instrument includes things like gang contacts, safe home, what are some other common ones that are in, prior arrests is another one that should not be in there because it's the fact of arrest only. It's not a prior finding of guilt. So Cook keeps validating their instrument and revising it. Last fall, they made changes decreasing the points for some of the offenses, and as a result, there was a 9% reduction in children screened into detention. But let me make this point. When you go to the hospital emergency room, there's a screen, right? Somebody takes your vitals there at the front desk and says, okay, what are you here for? And they make a decision. Do you go right back in or do you wait a while? That's just a screen. That's all that is. That's not the doctor looking at you. That's not the x-ray really examining what's going on. That's just a screen. All across the state, when I question people about detention hearings and I say, well, when you have the detention hearing in court, when you go back into the emergency room and the doctor looks at you, when you have the detention hearing in court, what happens? And what I hear back over and over again is, oh, most of the kids are kept in detention because we do a good job of screening kids. That means, if that's the response you get here, that means your children are not receiving adequate defense and your court is not doing its job and doing an adequate review. Now, Cook County started under some duress, I might say, 24/7 court review. They began weekend detention hearings in court November 5th, and they've been measuring and tracking the result of those. They've had 340 weekend reviews since November 5th. 63% of the children have been held, but 37% have been released. Now, these are kids that were screened into detention with one of the best and most objective screening instruments in the state. But the court, when it gave it a real thorough review, realized that 69 could go home on electronic monitoring, 7 could go to a secure shelter, and 50 could go home, just go home. 50. Some of these cases were nollied there on the weekend, in the weekend hearing. One of the reasons this is working is because their defenders have staff, I don't think they're social workers, but they're assistants, that can interview the kids and the families and look for alternatives and help bring more information before the judge at that hearing. This is the way every detention hearing should be going in this state. A good percentage should result in release. Otherwise, you're not getting into the emergency room. You're just there at the front desk. Objective factors in the screen only, and your defense lawyers should really be trained. There are national training modules from the National Juvenile Defender Center. You should insist that you have defense lawyers who are there present in person with the children, who are talking to the children and their families ahead of time. You should insist that your defenders have resources to help identify alternatives. I think just North McLean County has always, the defenders have always had social workers to help as well, or at least one social worker. Now, you should also insist that no children be held under the age of 13. This is, by law, your system has to look for alternatives for children under the age of 13. But if you can't be sent to juvenile prison if you're found guilty until you're 13, you certainly shouldn't be held in detention before a trial if you're younger. This is just absurd. I took years ago the chief judge of Israel through our detention center in Cook County, and she said, "You mean you have an elementary school in your detention center?" She said, "We would never have that. There's no other country, at least developed country, that would allow children that young to be locked up." You should make sure detention is limited to arrests for new violent felony offenses. One of the favorite uses of detention is court warrants. Courts issue warrants based on failure to appear. Now, let's think about that for a minute. If you're a child and you can't even get a driver's license, but a judge is going to say you didn't show up in court and so we're going to lock you up in detention, failure to appear, it should be a non-entity when you're talking about children who aren't free agents themselves. You should insist that property offenses, nonviolent felony offenses, a probation violation should never end up in detention. You should insist that there be weekend reviews and that these weekend reviews be in court. And you should insist that defense counsel be there with the children for the weekend review. And you should also insist one county, and it may be yours, couldn't release children on electronic monitoring over the weekend because they didn't have probation staff working who could put the bracelets on. I don't like electronic monitoring particularly, but it's better than being in detention. And you should insist that every alternative be available on the weekend as well as during the week. There should be public oversight of the funding of your detention center, and you should insist on knowing who's going in it and why they're going in it and how long they're staying, and you should know what's happening to your children. We need, as a state, to have an independent oversight body for detention centers as well. And this is something that a 12-year-old at a school near the Cook County Jail in Chicago drew. I was asked to go in and judge an art show, and this was one drawing that one of the students did. And it was sad that he could even imagine himself in jail, but he imagined himself in jail and imagined somebody saying, "Time to turn off the lights," and being left alone in the dark. And that's what I think we have to think of. That's what detention is for children. We need to end it as quickly as we can. So thank you very much for letting me speak.
sent this article about 10-year-old kids going to, that I printed and shared for you guys. And any questions or, yeah?
I have one. At the very beginning, Betsy, you talked about the correlation between, excuse me, being in detention and having worse and worse outcomes. I can hear talking to people about that in my head and having them say back to me, oh, but those kids would have had those outcomes anyway. It's not because they were in detention, it's because they're bad kids. How do you tease apart the figures that show that no, this is actually not a companion result, but a cause? Detention's the cause of deterioration of, so whatever you want to say, self-control, finishing, future thoughts, planning, what? Because this is something that I need to be able to defend.
We should be able to get you that information. Dr. Linda Teplin's work was, there are a couple of bulletins from the Federal Office of Juvenile and OJJDP under the Justice Department documenting that. She, of course, made comparisons to populations that weren't in detention. Same with all of the research. They made comparisons, but the research is absolutely crystal clear. It doesn't matter how good the program is in the facility or how kind the workers are. Detention itself is harmful, period, just the fact of it.
So those places that had detention still were compared with those who didn't to get similar
Similarly
populations?
situated
Or,
children,
and
yes.
those probably that used to have it were compared with results later when they stopped it, or if they didn't have it and they started it. So there are some figures you're saying that show that. Thank you.
Yeah, we can get you that, yeah.
I have a question. You indicated that the data shows detention results in psychiatric disorders. Is there any data that shows that perhaps children who have mental health issues are overrepresented in the detention center? I mean, because I would think that there is some kind of parallel to that. Kids who are suffering from whatever, psychiatric trauma or, mental health issues would result in them perhaps being in detention more often than kids who don't have those particular problems.
There's been some studies correlating brain injuries with a greater tendency for incarceration. There have been some studies of asthma as another predictor, but and I'm going to go way off. I'm sure Kareem is going to correct me here. Way off the, just give you my own impressions after many, many years. Generally speaking, a child who happens to live near a detention center and who is in a community that is not perceived as being advantaged or having political power is more likely to end up in detention. So, for example, the detention center in Chicago, whenever we zip code map it, it's the kids that live right near it, because the kids that are in the way south suburbs, the police aren't going to bother to drive them an hour downtown for a rinky-dink offense. But the police that are right there in the district, right next to the detention center, it's easy to drop the kid off. That's just my own personal opinion.
Okay, so one of the things that I was getting at is having worked in child welfare and in social service, I can, just off the top of my head, think about at least 3 cases where a juvenile, one child really had issues with, he started developing the inability to be in enclosed spaces and that kind of stuff. So what he would do is leave home in order to be outdoors. And then his mom, in an attempt to get help for him, She contacted the school, she contacted the police, and they said, well, you should report him as a runaway. And that resulted in him being taken to court and being told by the judge, if you leave home without your mother's permission, you're violating a court order, and we will lock you up. And so, regretfully, he got criminalized. Despite all of our best efforts to get some other kind of intervention, he ended up actually going to kiddie prison, is what I call it, because he got sanctioned. He was considered a runaway. And again, the fact being a runaway is a criminal offense for a juvenile. But as I said, 3 of these kids had some mental health issues. And this community didn't address those, and they instead were criminalized. So that was my question. Is there any data that looks at children who may have adjustment disorders or whatever, winding up in the juvenile criminal system?
And I think Dr. Linda Teplin's data does document some of what you're saying in terms of increased mental health and substance abuse disorders throughout their life. But again, I think it depends on where you live, because children who are in advantaged communities have mental health issues as well, but do not end up in detention or in this. I think it's just really geography and race, I think, is the geography, race, and economics, I think, are the predictors. We need vigorous programs for all of our children, no doubt, but it's really, luck of the draw, which door you go through, whether you go through the child welfare door, or you get mental health services through a separate system, or you end up labeled delinquent.
Yeah, and I think there is a survey or data that's been collected in IDJJ that, some astounding number, 70% or something of kids in kid prison have learning and disabilities or mental health, and so that's an overrepresentation than the compared to the population. But yeah, I mean, I don't know the cause, is it the first, it's chicken and an egg kind of thing, but it's clear that the data shows that detention does not improve mental health disorders or outcomes. Either can create or make worse those things. Are there any other questions? Oh,
Yes.
yeah, go ahead, Brenda.
Betsy, first, thank you so much for this informative presentation, just some great recommendations. I wanted to, I had several questions, and then I wanted to share with you what we've preliminarily are going to recommend on the adult side and try to, whatever reforms we're asking for the adults, I want to see if we can do parallel reforms for the juveniles and kind of see where it might be tweaked. And by the way, I'm not working on the juvenile justice end of this, but one of the questions I have on the juvenile justice end, if a police officer is taking somebody to detention, to what extent, under the law, can the detention personnel say that person isn't coming in? And then the second, though, is what happens as a matter of practice. And in other words, even if they have certain authority, are they going to say they were brought here, so we'll let the judge decide? Can you comment on that, please?
Sure. I don't know who actually executes the screen, but the police have to make a call to whoever the screener is. Usually it's probation, to say, I have this kid, this age, this charge. Does this kid meet the points to bring them to detention? So you need to look at that screen.
So again, just to clarify, so under the law, Illinois state law, there are no limitations, and this comes up to the screening instrument that is devised by
Right.
whomever.
Could be anything.
All right. So that's what I wanted to know, because the criminal justice system, it's a bit more complex. And one of our recommendations, right now, the current practice, the judge has issued, a chief judge has issued a standing order to permit some people to be turned away, and I applaud him for that. We want that authority to be expanded, and the sheriff's not going to do it without the judges ordering it. So I wanted to see about, and my guess is the same would hold true with detention, but I just wanted to see if the law itself was going to hamstring that. But it sounds like it comes down to that screening instrument. So you're saying make sure that that screening instrument is devised in a way that only somebody brought in for a new violent offense is going to
Right.
actually
And-
come in, correct?
And 13 or older.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay. Then, once they're brought in, and then they'll go before the judge, you're saying then there may be the judge may decide for the person to be released and looking at all these factors with a risk assessment, correct? With a risk assessment instrument, validated risk
Usually
assessment?
probation across the state does the, not Maisie, Yazzie risk assessment.
Okay.
Yes.
Because that's what I wanted to share with you. With the adults in our county, this has been proven to be surprisingly controversial. We do not have validated risk assessment. The chief judge has opposed that. We do not have pretrial services, to help monitor people or literally provide reminders regarding court appearances and the like. So we will be recommending validated risk assessments and as race neutral as possible, because there's some excellent risk assessment instruments. So I wanted to ask you then about the instrument you referred to on the juvenile end. A lot of the instruments that are out there in the adult area actually have racially disparate effects because they look at the housing situation, for example. Is the one that's kind of, sounds like the one that's being used, does it have factors that actually exacerbate racial disparity?
That's a good question, and I know it is the one used across the state, but it is not dispositive of the detention hearing.
Right.
And I'm not sure how often it even comes in, actually, to the detention hearing. The Yazzie is something that probation uses, but I'm not sure how often they present the result to the judge. the critical issue at the detention hearing is really whether you have a defense counsel who's really doing a defense counsel job for the kid, who's trained and resourced.
And on the adult end, the research is so strong that the validated risk assessment instrument is not to discount the need for that advocacy, but that informs that advocacy, and it makes a huge difference in terms of the numbers of people who are detained in jail. So I guess my supposition, but suppositions are dangerous, is that those kinds of instruments could be used effectively with the juveniles. But it's not dispositive, like you said. The judge might still, would always retain discretion. And I'm still curious about the instrument, because the norm has been risk assessment instruments that are racially disparate, but now we have some great ones that are not. So I really think that's something, because one thing we may be doing is recommending changes in state laws or state practices that are exacerbating that. So if that instrument is a piece of the problem, we have to pick and choose what we're going to comment on, but I just wanted to find out about that. Thank you.
Champaign County may use the MAZI risk assessment, because we were just there, actually, at detention last week, and I think that's what the detention superintendent relayed to us, that they use a tool called the MAZI assessment.
And I think every detention center, many of them use the MAZI. The MAZI is more suicidal risk, where the YAZI gets closer to risk assessment. But honestly, there are questions about these, at least from the defense community. And I haven't sat through detention hearings in your county. I don't know how much they rely on either the YAZI or the MAZI. I assume probation's doing the YAZI as well.
Yeah, I think in Champaign, there's two tools being used. One is detention screening, right? When a kid is brought in by a police officer, a risk assessment of their, are they going to harm themselves or others, and are they safe community, affecting community safety, and that could be the MAZI. But then there's a second one that's used by probation then to determine factors that would help, how do we help a child? What are the other needs and things?
There are actually three, Sarah.
Okay, yeah.
So there's the detention screen that's just one page, and that's just add up the points. What's the charge? Are there prior convictions? And that's the one that could have a lot of subjective factors you don't want. Then there's the YAZI, which is used by probation more for risk. And I don't know at what point they give that. That would be further down the road. The MAZI, I think, is pretty early on into entry into the detention center, because that's worry about suicide risk.
And there is much talk in the state about developing a statewide screening assessment tool, so that every single detention center will have the same tool. And some people are all for it, but it hasn't come to the point where people all agree that that's what needs to be done. So I know that there's much discussion, though, happening right now about that.
I had a quick question. Are you familiar with the 40 Assets program, the tool that measures what's in place for especially young people, socially, emotionally, environmentally, educationally, so on, that helps them grow?
No?
Okay. It's not an assessment for juvenile delinquency type work or that kind of thing that we're talking about. I don't even know if that's the right word to use. To use the word that used to be phrased not to describe it. But we've used it on and off in this community through the decades as an assessment to see how well certain programs, certain school programs or community programs meet the needs of kids, and how to tell which kids should be in which programs. But you don't know anything about that? Okay.
I don't know. Do you? Sorry.
We really appreciate it, and I'll send out her PowerPoint electronically, and so that you guys have all of that information. And Susan and Karima, if you don't mind coming up there, and I'm going to bring you one more mic up there as And if it's okay with everyone, we'll just continue with the presentation, then we'll get back to like the minutes of stuff. Or you need to go? Okay. I think the only thing we have to do is approval of the agenda and minutes, voting wise. Is that okay? Is that right? So because Carolyn's got to go, should we do that before we lose our quorum? Okay, so noting the third thing on our agenda is approval of the agenda. If we can just do that, if you guys don't mind, we've got someone who's got to go a little early, and so while we have a quorum, we're gonna, you live for this stuff, man.
I move second.
Thank you, Mariam, thank you. Esther, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Looking at the minutes from May 10th, 11th,
I move approval.
thank you, Esther.
We had so many issues last time.
Ryan wants us to have issues. Lynn, there's, okay. That's okay. Okay, so I hear a motion from Esther to approve the minutes from May 11th. Anybody got a second? Thank you, Jerry. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great, business done. Oh, any public participation? Okay, well, seeing none, hearing none. I'm channeling Sam, I think, on that one. We'll move on to our second presentation. So we're going to welcome Susan Whitkin and Karima Douglas. If you guys could describe both, you have separate things, but also together things, roles. So if you don't mind telling everybody about your work, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Susan Whitkin. I work for the University of Florida. We've been talking about that too long. We both went to the same college, not at the same time, unfortunately. University of Illinois at the Center for Prevention Research and Development. And the work we're going to be talking about tonight is work that both of us do with the Illinois Juvenile Justice Council. And that is the state advisory group for funding that comes into the state from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So they comply with what OJJDP asks for, and so a lot of what we get is, collecting data and reporting back to the federal level, and trying to really work with the various agencies within the juvenile justice system to do a lot of what Betsy was talking about, to identify issues and to get the information to the right people, and so that the commission then can advocate for certain changes. And one of the changes that they just recently made and got through legislation was there was no data on juvenile transfer for a long time. And we knew that juvenile transfers were happening, we just didn't know how many and what they were for. So we're just in the process of collecting the first data round on that. So, and that means transfer to adults. Yes, juveniles from juvenile arena up into the adult. So you can talk about who you are.
Oh, this is my big debut. My name is Karima Douglas. I am a project director with the Illinois Collaboration on Youth, but I work as a contractor and staff for the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission. And one of my roles with the commission is to act as the statewide coordinator around racial and ethnic disparities, or DMC, Disproportionate Minority Contact. And so I'll go into that in a little bit, but essentially there is federal law that that requires that states address issues of racial and ethnic inequality in the juvenile justice system. And part of my job is, unfortunately, not to can't solve systemic racism, but to help local counties and the state as a whole to figure out ways to address it, and whatever that means.
Mm-hmm. So part of what I do is work with data and help groups like local juvenile justice councils understand the best way to go about getting their data and to help their communities and do other research topics that the commission might be involved in. So a lot of it's just data and understanding it. So I passed out a few things. There's one page that starts with the 9 decision points. So these 9 decision points are very important for any location. It's a one-pager right here, 9 decision points. It's very important because, well, this is what OJJDP recognizes as the 9 important steps throughout the juvenile justice system for juveniles. So we want to see who comes into the system at the arrest point and where we don't necessarily know who all the, we can't track Susan in the beginning all the way through, but we can find out how many youth come in at arrest, what happens at referrals, and go on to see how the population changes. So are we looking at, the racial makeup at arrest? Is it the same at the time they go for commitment? So this data is collected across the state for all 102 counties, and Champaign is one of them. And that's the document that I said that hasn't been fully released to the, we've used it, and we get this data from Champaign County. So this isn't data that we went out and got ourselves. Champaign County puts it together and sends it to us, or sends it mainly to Karima. So, but it recognizes these 9 decision points, and a lot of the counties in the state cannot respond to some of these decision points, and so when we see that too, we recognize that there's something that we need to go out and do some assistance with if they are unable to collect the data. So what this is really important data, and to really understand, yes, the system. And one of the reasons this is so important, I mean, you can see the racial breakout, you can see the kind of offenses that come in, what are the top 10 different offenses. In the detention part of it, you can see what time the admissions to detention occur, so is it really happening in the morning, is it happening after school, or is it happening in the middle of the night? And so you just get a better picture of what's happening out there with these kids. So this data is what you need to make decisions. So that's very important, and I don't want to go into all the details about what the data says. I mean, you can read it yourself and probably do that, because I know we don't have a lot of time. But I've given out some other handouts that I want to make sure. There's also a flow chart of the juvenile justice system, and this is the process generally. I mean, there's probably a lot more that we could have added in here, but this is the process that the youth would take from the time of the incident all the way down to being discharged if they actually got into detention or DJJ. So this is the whole entire process. And I think it's important to understand it is a much more complicated process than even this table displays. But I think that's one of the reasons sometimes while it's difficult to get data is because there's so many different entities and they're not necessarily communicating with each other. So you might have the police are here, and then you have detention here, and then you have the court here. And that is why the juvenile justice councils, if it's complemented with the appropriate individuals, can be so incredibly important to a county. Because if you have somebody from all the police departments, and you have somebody from the court, and you have somebody from probation, they actually begin to hear the issues that the other group has. And they don't, normally they don't think about that. And I've been in these meetings where I hear that. So we hope to be able to spend some more time doing technical assistance with these councils across the state to help them understand more about what they do affects the next step with the youth and the various agencies themselves. So it's a complicated process, and like I said, because of that, you have some of these silos built around. And what we hope to try to do is to, like I said, just get people talking more and looking at the data. So one of the things of data that I do have that we can talk about in depth if you want to or not, or just kind of rush over, but I gave you also another link, this page here that has a link to the detention. And I know from what Sarah said that she has shared this report with you already, but every year through the work with the commission, we do a detention data report. At CPRD where I work, we have the access to the entire detention data that we could across the state. So we do reports for the commission, and about 3 years ago, we decided to do a statewide report, one that we could pull all the information together, look at data every which way that we could think of, and make it public and transparent so that we could see what every county is doing and what, what's the racial makeup and what the ages of the youth are and who stays in longer than the other kind of groups. So that is the link to this book here. It's a 2015 version on there. We have one from 13, 14, and now 15. We're working on 16 right now. So, and there's also a comparative report. So when we put out 2015, we do a comparative report comparing it to the year before. So if you just want to look at the comparative report, see what changed, what improved, and what that's online as well. So one of the things that Betsy was talking about was where Champaign falls in there. And there are lots of different tables. And when you look at this, hopefully you will, we look at straight admission data and where the counties fall. And of course, Cook is always at the top because Cook has so many cases. So we sort of take them out of the table because it would skew the table so much. But besides just looking at admission data, we do another table where we calculate a rate. Because what's important is to compare your population. You might look at Cook County population and you say, this has to be horrible. They have 3,000 admissions. But compared to their population, they are below the median in the state. So how the number of youth they're coming in, in Champaign, you're number 5 on the top, towards the top. So, to be high, you don't want to be on the high on the list. You want to be median to low. So that's what everybody always says, well, Cook has to be, and so by doing this, you actually see where it lies. But that's only when you compare it to the population. So we take the population of Champaign County, we take the population of the detention, and we come up with a rate. And those are very telling when to normalize the data this way. So we have all kinds of things. We have rates and we have indexes that are all explained in here. We have graphics of the state map, so you can see where things lie around, because sometimes you'll have a county that has a lot of detention admissions, and then you'll see a lot around that, and oftentimes that's because there's one detention center that gets everybody, and it seems that sometimes that you see a lot of increases around that. But these are very informative, and to be able to go forward with what you want to do as a plan, as a group, the idea is to understand, ask your questions, your research questions, or the questions that you want answered as a group. What do we want to know in order to tackle this? And if you want to know what's happening in the juvenile justice system, you need to start getting out the data, because if you don't have the data, you're never going to get the truth, if you will, of what's actually happening. And it's hard to get what we have on the list that's we passed around is arrest data, and that arrest data comes from the Illinois Juvenile Justice, the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, and they get their data from the Illinois State Police, and that's what they call the CRI system. But that data there that's listed is only it's no misdemeanors. It's low. Is it no misdemeanors or misdemeanor A's and B's?
They're just not required.
Right, we're not required to report it. But that is the only state entity that we can get all counties from. So even though it may not be all arrest, when you look at that, it's consistent across the counties of how they collect the data. And so that's also important, is if you want to start getting police data in your community, you're going to probably want Urbana police arrest and Champaign police arrest. You need to understand that how they count arrests, because Champaign may count them on a list differently than Urbana, differently than University of Illinois, all these types of things. So when you're comparing your data, be very careful that you're looking at the same thing from different entities. because when I get a lot of data, it's sometimes all very different. And that's very important. So again, and I don't know where you are if you're looking to gather data, but typically when we get involved in something, we ask everybody, you know, what do you want to know? Get some defined questions. What do you want to know? And then look at those questions and say, well, what do we need in order to get those questions answered? So if it's data, if it's going out and talking to people, that's still a collection of data. It's a, you know, qualitative activity, which is still also very, very important. And is it to better understand the community, what services are available? So gather all this data, and then once you have that data, analyze it and look at it, put it into perspective. Like I said, perhaps normalize it to your community, and really fully understand the data. And once you have that, then you can begin to make your decisions about what your next steps are. Because if you don't have the data and you don't have the backing behind it, it's very often if you go to try to, we want to do X, and they're going to say Y, you have to have some, like you were talking before, something behind you in order to give you that confidence and the credibility that this is actually what does need to be fixed. And the hardest part most of the time is to really understanding what you want, what your questions are, because people will just have these broad questions, and so those are, you know, really big things. But if you narrow it down to look specifically, what do you want to know and what do you need to gather in order to answer that? So like the analogy Betsy was using in the hospital, or you go to the doctor, you know, that's exactly what they do. You know, they ask you all these questions, and then they start looking into it, and then they gather all the data, and then eventually come back to you and say, this is what's happening. So that would be my recommendation for all of you. You may be doing it, because I don't know all the past of what you've done, which I probably should, and I live in Champaign. So, but it's a path. So is there anybody here, and again, this one 2-pager, there's a little 2-pager in here. This is data from the detention report, and I have listed what Champaign's numbers are, and I have statewide to compare it by percentages. And I also list there, you know, you have a breakdown by race, and you have a breakdown by, I think it's by age in here as well. Well, you have the average daily population, how many youth are in detention at any one time. And again, we also look at a rate of that, normalize that, and how long the stays are when you're actually in detention. So this is some data on detention that you can share, and you can share anything that's in this. If you go online to look and you see this, you can share this data as well. But any questions? Anybody?
Actually, you
Sure.
have one? You want to go first? Okay, so this is actually not relating to the data, but you had mentioned that you have the Juvenile Justice Commission, and you'd mentioned it sounded like there are diverse stakeholders on that, and you mentioned that's important. I wanted to talk about a little bit about the local level, because and I don't know what's happening here. I do know on the adult end, several years ago, a task force I was on recommended that there be a coordinating council to bring in diverse stakeholders and the community to work long-term, not only on implementing certain recommendations, but just, again, to do the coordination that you mentioned is needed. Seems to me that no matter what we recommend, there's going to be a lot of follow-up, and there's going to be a lot of things we don't even have the time to delve into. So I wanted to just gain your insights, and maybe, you know, anybody else's here about a planning structure on the local level, because it seems to me that there's a possibility, we haven't really talked about this, but about, you know, making some recommendation and make sure there's follow-up and long-term coordination to deal with issues that will reduce the racial disparity in the juvenile justice system as well.
Well, I think Champaign had a juvenile justice council at one point in time. I don't know that they officially disbanded it, but I think it's pretty much disbanded. I was just at the detention center last week, and Connie Kaiser is the superintendent there. And we were talking about something like that. And, but I don't think that there's one functioning one right now in Champaign. I would suggest to try to get something like that, because I think that a community group, while extremely important and should be involved in something, in a council like that, I also think that you really need the representation of the agencies on that. And a lot of times, you know, they'll have the chief judge as the chairman or the head of probation as the chairman. But I would, and I don't know who in the county was originally on Champagne's. I mean, if you want to contact Connie Kaiser, she would know the background on that. And I think she's very accessible and would be happy. I mean, I shouldn't speak for her, but I think she'd be very happy just to talk to whoever would call. But I think that's an important step to try to get people together to really review what's important, and to really have and I see councils across the state. Some of them are very Cook County has a very cohesive juvenile justice council, and they work with a lot of national entities, and JDI, the Annie E. Casey Fund comes
they have
in.
a JDI committee.
Were you making faces?
My face was about, they don't call themselves a juvenile justice council.
No, they don't.
But they operate as one. yeah,
Sorry.
Often.
Yes.
Yeah.
And probation is very involved. And they've also, over the years, really gotten a lot of data out and publicly presented some data. They, like I said, they work with national entities to help guide with best practices on what the best things to do for different circumstances are. But there's other county. Lake County is also another good county that has a lot of initiatives going on. In fact, their Juvenile Justice Council puts together a whole book as big as this. In fact, I could have brought it tonight, but like this, of all of the services and all of the processes within their own county. And it's really, it's excellent. But the Juvenile Justice Council put that together so that they understood what was happening in their own community and different resources that were available. You know, there's some juvenile justice councils that aren't very successful, and sometimes that's when the leadership doesn't have the buy-in that everybody else on the table wants to, so that's very important to get someone who's truly involved and wants to be on this. But it's usually a mix of, like I said, the community can be involved. I'd recommend social services be involved, schools be involved, and of course, besides just the juvenile justice area. And the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission just had a grant out there for funding, so that if you know, even to create one or do whatever, I mean, that process is now over. But I think every year they put that out to be able to fund a council that wants to do something specific and that they can help them. So, I don't know.
Yeah, just to point out that, yeah, I mean, there are opportunities here that Champaign is missing out on funding-wise, resource-wise, because of a lack of organization around these issues. So a active juvenile justice council is something that used to happen. And essentially, in most counties, it was the same people that would already have similar meetings, right? You already got to get together to talk about X, Y, or Z. So why not make it a monthly thing, and then we focus our on solving some of the issues. But it's kind of, as Susan said, it hasn't formally disbanded, but it's just, there's nothing formal happening. But we're missing opportunities to even get money to help us plan what it might look like and other things. So that was definitely a recommendation that'll come out in this piece, I think.
And even if you can't get certain key stakeholders involved, it doesn't mean you can't start one, even though that would be ideal to have them all. But ideally, your council could do something and show yourself off a little bit, and then you'll have more interest, and more people will be, wanting to jump on the bandwagon.
I have two quick questions. How do you spell Witkin?
I can answer that one. Good. Witkin.
Oh, okay.
And I have cards.
And
I actually-
the other one is a little more challenging.
Oh, okay.
Why do we have a defunct juvenile justice center and council, and is it political? What's it under? Who appoints it?
Do you know the full answer to that one?
I have the full answer. I mean, everything's political, But I will say there is a statute that that lays out some more specifics. I think they're called not Juvenile Justice Council, but Juvenile, it's a JCEC. And we can share that with you, but it does say, at least in the past, that the state's attorney should be the convener of these bodies, and they were very heavily weighted in that, in this, whoever the state's attorney's office wanted to be at those tables. That is no longer required that they are the ones that have to be the convener, but usually that when you have buy-in from the state's attorney's office, they usually have the chief judge, the chief of, superintendent from the detention centers. But what was not happening was they were not getting adequate representation. They were supposed to have representation, or it was recommended to have schools at the table, to have community service providers, to have youth. So it's supposed to be balanced in having both those stakeholders that make the kind of decisions that they could bring to county boards and things like that, but also have folks that were directly working with youth, were not connected to this county government or state government, and they were supposed to do both. So I think what happened here, there could be several reasons. One, I don't think it was being funded for a while. I don't think that the state's attorney's office and whoever the chief judge was at that time was committed to the, it could look like a system reform kind of effort, and if there is not a champion in the courts or in the probation or court services department that wants reform, they will see a body like that as a challenge to the status quo and would not want it to remain in place. And if there's a council in place for a long enough time and it is not being paid attention to by the people who are decision makers, then no one would want to keep coming back. So if they only have like lower level staff that are attending, and by the time they bring it to their boss does not take their recommendations, then the lower level staff are going to stop being a champion of the group. And over time, it's not going to work.
Who would fund it? Who would fund the?
The commission has, Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission has federal funds that come in to organize juvenile justice councils, and counties or groups, some whole circuits, so like the Second Circuit is like 10 counties, and they apply as a together, and they have some minimal funding, as we were talking about earlier. Oftentimes a coordinator is somebody that's already at a social service organization or something else, and 10% of their time is to organize this council meeting or something like that. So it's not, you know, I mean, this is not a tremendous amount of money, but it is something.
Well, it can be quite significant.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some councils that get a good bit of money to help them create new programs.
Yep.
Besides paying for, so it depends upon what you want to do.
And in Champaign, I'll just say that one thing that I think was a big barrier to continuing the Juvenile Justice Council as it was prior was the Access Initiative kind of took all those key stakeholders to different committees and different work. And there was some thought that would, it would take this much time to do that, and then we'd kind of reconvene, and that hasn't really happened. So again, with leadership and other things driving that, it should have, but the Access Initiative, it was the same people at the same tables, right? So probation and judges and state's attorneys, and they were all focusing in on that initiative that had funding and had buy-in. And so there was kind of this, well, we'll put that on the back burner for the moment because we're kind of already doing it here.
So that Access Initiative is now gone, and had some money left over that couldn't be used because it wasn't accounted for and spent in time. And now we'd have to start over again and ask for money from the state that would
Well,
get
that's
it
one-
from the federal government.
It's one avenue. I'm sure that there might be other opportunities, but the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission does every year. Last month, I think, was it March or April, that they put out a notice of funding opportunity, and you could apply if that's what you wanted to.
But the state's attorney and the chief judge would have to be the drivers of that in this county, or could someone else?
It's ideal because of the decision-making pieces, but it doesn't have to be the starting point, I don't think. And money doesn't have to be a factor either.
Right.
I mean, we're talking, many juvenile justice councils meet for 1 hour once a month to talk about what are the issues that we want to do address together, similar to our work here. And if we make recommendations, then one of them is a juvenile justice council, and here are the things the council can address. They've already got, something to start working with, and there doesn't need to be money associated with it. It's just always nice if there is, and there's ways to help with that. Does
And
that
we could
help?
even ask for different people to be involved in it than before, right?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
as I said, anybody, it could be totally community driven, but if you want to see system reform, then the people that have that capacity to make those should be at the table and a part of the decision-making process.
Yes.
I have one just small question. On the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission data listing with arrest reports, there's one, for number 2, the top 10 offenses, there's 0 listed under Black non-Hispanic and a lot on Black Hispanic. Are those two columns, is that just a formatting error that those two columns should be interchanged?
Maybe.
You might just
I
have to look
don't-
at that. if you
Yeah,
got
I
that.
don't know. Do you know?
It just seems unlikely that there are 0% non-Hispanic blacks and that,
Yeah, because at the top,
Well, what I
no,
have.
not on number 2. On number 2, it's the other way around.
What I have a feeling is that the data's probably not broken down in any way. So they just,
Oh, because, the other columns have Black non-Hispanic is where the numbers are, and it's 0 for Black Hispanic. So it looks like that's just a formatting
Number
thing where
2
those
is
two
wrong.
columns are switched, yeah, so.
Yeah.
I
number
just
1
like-
and number 3 reflect
Right,
what's
okay,
happening. in the-
right, thank you.
yeah.
And I had a question about the data too, Susan, while we've got you on the spot. So can you explain why we would have a different number for arrests than, total arrests, than referrals to court? Can you kind of give some of that understanding for us? Or Karima, yeah?
She's a lawyer here.
Not, I'm inactive. Yes, the arrests, the arrest reports that we get are from the state police system, like you said, so they don't always match up. But referrals to court were meant to directly reflect all of the arrests. So a kid can be booked and arrested and diverted immediately, and so they are never brought, referred to do anything further after that. So we actually want referrals to go down. Everything should be, yeah, I think that's because most of the data we got after arrest, detention, and admissions to DJJ were all statewide. They're the only statewide bodies of data that we have as a state. Everything else is county and local information. And so when we have to report every year, we get data directly from the counties, and they give us everything in between. And so when they give us referral information, the referral information doesn't necessarily speak back to the arrest data, because the arrest data could have been more. Local districts can report different numbers to us than they do to the state police system. Like she said, it doesn't include misdemeanors, but a police district might include misdemeanors, and then it will kind of taper off further down in the system. Ideally, we want, when we report, every decision point in the flow chart should speak back to the one before,
That's ideal.
because all of the rates are supposed to be based on number of arrests. So every referral should be based on number of arrests. Every petition should be based on every number of referrals and things like that. But that's only if Illinois operated like a thing that we could be proud of from time to time.
So could it though, are there some, I think we've found this in collecting data across the board.
It's hard. Although Champaign does have a unified system here, but I don't know that all pieces of each of those 9 decision points are part of it. But they do have a unified system within.
So for referrals to court to be higher than arrests, could it be that one arrest, that's what
Well,
I
remember,
think-
we don't have all the arrests listed here.
Oh,
That's just that, there's no misdemeanors, this
Oh,
is
right,
just the
right,
data
so-
from the Illinois State Police. So
Got
this
it.
number for arrest is going to be much
Yeah.
lower, or lower
Yeah.
than what the total number really
Okay.
is.
And technically, in some cases, a kid can be referred to court and not necessarily be arrested. So they can just, like, someone could just directly say, I want this kid brought in, at least that's what I've been told, brought directly to, like, a school can just be like, this kid needs to be referred for charges or whatever, and they may not be booked and look like they were arrested first. They may just go straight to the referral or the petition stage, and it just may miss the first kind of data collection source. And so things are a little wonky, and that's why there's always like several disclaimers before
Yes,
you
sir.
dive into
And I'm
the
sure you look at that and go, well,
information.
why are they collecting this if it isn't all complete? But it is, what, the reason is this Illinois State Police provides this data in a consistent manner every year. So we can look at this data knowing it doesn't represent everybody, but we can see how it increases or decreases or changes over time. So that gives us some insight into what's happening with the youth. Now, we know it's not everybody, and we wish it was, but sometimes you've just got to go with the best that you can get, because taking individual entities' data and combining them yourself, believe me, it's very difficult, and they do things differently. So this was the decision at the time, because this helps us comply with the reporting need that we have to make, or the commission has to make back to OJJDP. Okay, which one are you on, looking at? The black and white one with lots of lines? Just,
Okay, so can you define what white Hispanic, who would be white Hispanic?
a lot of Latinos represent themselves as white, and Latinos might represent themselves as black. So most of these are self-reporting by the individual.
So what about the ones who don't do either?
Then,
Are they on giving those two choices?
well, that is the way the Census Bureau does it, and so you're either Latino or you're not. So if you represent yourself as Latino, then you're there, and if you don't, you fall in the other category.
Okay, well, I know, I was in 2010 census, and so there were categories that people were not Hispanic, white. I mean, they could choose other because they didn't, like Cubanos, okay, or Colombians. I'll take that as a good example. So in Colombia, Colombian, I have some Colombian friends who are Morenos, so they wouldn't choose black or white, okay? Right, and same thing from Venezuela. So if when people choose other on the form,
They can.
then where do
can.
they, so
There's another
I
category.
see the other, and so we don't know
We don't know
what
if they're white or
racial
black, yeah.
categories those are? Okay, that was
Because
my question.
it's not often used, apparently.
Okay.
Yeah, on this.
Just on that subject, I've been looking up doing the jail, looking up the daily jail census, different people, and pretty much everybody has, and the IDs they use are from the census, black, Hispanic, white. Those are three, and when I found twice I found a U for unknown, and I don't know if that was the jail's determination, just say unknown, or if those are people's choices, black, white, or unknown, but that's, black, white, Hispanic, or unknown, but that's what I was seeing, and maybe, were you about to say something you saw?
Well, as you look at this, Hispanic is an ethnic category, not a racial category. And the police reports that we've seen, or the calculations we've seen, they treat it as a racial category. But this is different, and I think that's why you see black Hispanic, black non-Hispanic, white Hispanic, white non-Hispanic, et cetera.
I understand that.
Okay.
The people who have committed choice don't necessarily choose either of them.
Right.
Well, no, you self-identify. Although when the police write up their arrest report, they identify for you.
Yeah, particularly for juveniles, so if this juveniles aren't making this decision, are they? Or are they? the reporting authorities, are they making these classifications? The juveniles are not. Who's the reporting authority is making the classification?
Best practice is for the reporting authorities to ask the kid to self-identify.
Oh, they do, okay.
But they are the ones that are filling out the form, so they don't necessarily always take that step to do that. Are you done with your?
I think so. Yeah, I'm done.
It's pretty late. Did you want me to still do? Okay. Well, I applaud you guys. I go to a lot of meetings and they're never at night, and so this is prime time, and so I appreciate that you guys still do this at 8 o'clock at night. But I won't, because we spent some time on the data, we do, the commission does use the best data that Susan gives us, because Illinois does not have a whole lot of great information, and so we know we have great detention data, and we milk that for as much as we can. But everything else is just based on how great the local counties commit to getting good local data. And they are the best ones, and you guys are the best ones to make that determination. And if you see things in the data that's not reflective of your experience, and that's why councils are important too, is because if you had more people who were in facilities or in law enforcement, they are usually the ones that are most vocal about this data doesn't look right. And then if they say that doesn't look right, then my response is, well, you gave it to us, and so you can make it better. You can make it more accurate, more reliable, and then we can make better assessments if we have better information to work off of. But use this data as a jumping off point for better discussions and interventions. So to step back, I think my role, what I want to focus on is the race piece, because you guys are a racial justice task force, and I am often tasked with talking to groups of people about race that don't want to talk about race. And so I've become very comfortable talking about it because, one, because I had to, also because I'm Black, and a lot of people who are African American or of color have to become more comfortable talking about race for various reasons. But I think it's important that if you are doing this work, that you are committed to talking about it openly and honestly, establishing a common language is what I like to say, but being serious and explicit about what it is you're doing. I think what can be tricky sometimes is that because it's an uncomfortable conversation, it can start to be glossed over. You can start to say things like fairness. You can start to use like euphemisms for the thing that you're doing, and then by the time you get down to the end or your final recommendations or report, you may not see race in the report at all. You may get to a point where you say equity a lot. A lot of people like to say socioeconomic status because they use it as a proxy for race, which can be the case if your data reflects that, but you should also say, if it's so easy for you to use socioeconomic status as a proxy for race, then you need to talk about why race can be a proxy for socioeconomic status, because that is a reflection of what racial equity looks like in your community and in the juvenile justice system. So some of the language that we use, you can get familiar with around juvenile justice work, and we've used it already. Disproportionate minority contact is both about youth of color coming into contact with the system at rates that are not proportionate to what your community looks like, so what the population is of your community, but it's also about the gap between youth of color and white youth coming into contact with the system. And so it's important for you to do both, and the data that you have in front of you does do that. So you may see the top line, I think in one of your things, talks about totals across the board of youth of color, of youth in Champaign County. So how many Black youth you have in the county. Oh, thank you. And then you start to go down into how many kids were arrested. But you should do both. If there's a number of kids that are arrested that, if you have 17% Black youth in your community, and 60% of the youth in detention are Black, you see that as a gap. But you're supposed to also be comparing with how many white youth are usually the control group, how many white youth are coming into contact with the system, and then compare that number to the number of African-American youth, Latino youth, those kinds of things. And if you're looking at the data and you're like, arrest is one of those pieces that you don't have good data around Latino youth because, as the gentleman said here, I think that's Gerald, people don't often make the distinction between race and ethnicity, and everything is lumped in. Sometimes you start to lose information around Latino youth because they just get counted in multiple other groups and never get reflected appropriately. So that's what DMC kind of breaks down. The Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP, is an oversight body from the Department of Justice that manages and distributes funds to state for juvenile justice work. So the reason that the commission is in existence as a state advisory group is not only to do recommendations and provide technical assistance around things like this, around detention data, around race and ethnicity, around raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction, but also to distribute funds, federal dollars, to local jurisdictions like this one to carry out what we determine to be, what you guys determine to be best practice. And so in order to get those funds, there are responsibilities and accountability that the counties and the state has to commit to. And that's when you hear all of these letters and acronyms, is because the commission has to report and be accountable, but any sub-grantee, any county that gets those dollars has to be accountable to the state and then to the federal government to make sure that that as a state still get access to the kind of resources that we need to carry out what we know to be best for the kids. And the law that allows us to do that is the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which tells us the 4 core requirements that a state should be monitoring for to ensure that they are at least meeting the bare minimum of how to treat youth in the state who are coming in contact with the system, juvenile justice system. And addressing racial and ethnic disparities is the 4th most recent core requirement. And addressing disproportionate minority contact, which means all 9 decision points, looking at racial equity at all 9 decision points, was only brought into the law in 2002. And I bring that up just because when you're making these recommendations, I think you should state that you're not just doing it because it is a moral assessment, that you're making a value judgment about racial equity and fairness, but you're also committing to a mandate from the federal government to states to act on this issue. And so some people feel like it's wishy-washy. It's a choice based on just just who the people in the room are at the time and how much they care about youth of color. But you should also stress that if you want the state to be in compliance with federal law, these are the things you should do. And the more out of compliance we are as a state, which we've been known to be in the past, and if you don't want to use litigation or consent decrees to get to the place that you know to be the best for kids, you should probably just try to be in compliant from the beginning. And with racial equity, it doesn't carry quotas. And so sometimes, at least when I started, I was like, the only way to say that you're successful at addressing racial equity is, if you had to look at an objective measurement, it would be you need to see as many white kids coming into contact with the system as every other group. And the only way to do that by numbers is to arrest as many white kids, detain as many white kids, commit detention. And it's because of civil rights law, you can't establish a quota as a state or as a county to say, oh, I'm sorry, you've arrested too many kids of color today, and so you have to stop until that many white kids can come in at the same time. That's the bar that we can't have. But everything below that is up to you in terms of addressing it, because that's all the law says, is address it. And so it's up to you to set the standard that you want to make as far as how far you want to go to addressing it, what commitments and recommendations you want to make to say that you're adequately working towards solutions to what you know to be a problem. The numbers are important to to give to naysayers, to critics. But if you're not, if you already have drunk the Kool-Aid that this is a problem, that if you walk into a detention center, it shouldn't be 83% Black in any part of the state of Illinois. But even in Cook County, that is majority minority, it is close to 90% Black in the detention center, and they've done amazing reforms. But no one walking in there thinks that that's the right thing that's supposed to do. But some people are like, well, they deserve it. So that's when you use the data, however flawed it is, but you should also start to commit to, but we also know if you can't have every number perfect, you should be talking about broader issues around racial equity and what commitment you want to make to doing that. And so that's why I stress using the mandate as a way of communicating that as well. Any questions so far? Am I making sense, JD? Okay.
No, but it just hurts to keep hearing it over and over and putting it together. I'm glad you're speaking it. Sharon Davies wrote a report that I footnote in my too long stuff I sent you guys, and one of the things she pointed out in racism is that structural racism continues. Even if you remove every racist person in a system, you have the same outcome because the structure has been set that way. And you're mentioning numbers. In Champaign County, say we have 15% African-American population, then for every one African-American arrested, we should have 6 and 2/3 white people also arrested. And it's in a footnote, and you're saying, well, we can't do that. Of course we can't, but it brings it to stark realization that the structure is set up. And unless we are, someone earlier talked about intentionality, I think that was Betsy, unless we're intentional in addressing these issues, every single decision and step, it's not going to change.
Yeah. And so I know from the commission's point of view, it's about system reform. And so just be cognizant of how you talk about these issues, that you can easily get derailed into conversations about broad topics that you know that you can't tangibly address. And so if you get into conversations or in your report that start to skew towards, well, race is a problem, but so is geography, so is mental health resources, so is so many other things, that when someone reads that, they instantly become overwhelmed because they're like, we can't solve poverty, we can't solve drug addiction, we can't solve all of these things, so we won't try to solve any of them. And that's an easy way to be a cop-out and avoid the topic completely and avoid a solution-based approach, which is the most effective way to get at the issue. So you should both be intentional about bringing up the topic of race, about laying out precise reasons that you're tackling the issue, whether it be the law or the data in front of you, both, and then go into, but the only reason why we're bringing this up is because we want to intervene on these very specific areas that we know that we can tackle. And when you're solution-oriented instead of kind of broad value judgments, war on poverty, war on bad people, individual bad actors, those are easy ways to get to make a losing kind of argument. Because this has been a part of the law for over 20 years now, and no state can raise their hand and say we've done this well, that we have adequately addressed racial and ethnic disparities. Look at how great, look at how equitable our system is. No one has been able to do that. But the only places that can claim success are individual counties that can point to a policy, practice, or program intervention that said we reduced the gap between youth of color and white youth in these communities, in their contact with the system, in these very specific ways. And we can point to where there are successes and why. And that's the most persuasive argument you can make in these spaces. And the only way to do that is to talk about race from the beginning so that you can continue to point back to that when you're starting to see progress or success. And if you start to see success, like in Illinois, I think we were talking about that earlier, is that in Cook County, we've seen detention numbers go down. We've seen detention centers close. We've seen DJJ facilities close. But with those things that reformers are really proud of, no one can be proud of seeing the racial and ethnic gap close at all. If anything, it's gone up. So even though there are only less than 350 kids in Cook County detention, if they're all still Black, we didn't approach the problem from the beginning in the way that we should have, and now we have to work backwards to see where did we miss these, where did we go wrong in not looking at racial impact in the way that we approached our advocacy from the beginning, and now we can't retroactively kind of point to where we missed those things in the approach that we took, even though they were still best practice. It's too easy. It's a cop-out to say that a rising tide lifts all ships, because it clearly doesn't. So whoever the kids are that are being diverted, they're not being diverted at the same rates from the system as other kids for various reasons. And that's why it's important to start with the data, so you can track exactly how many kids are using the kind of system reform efforts and programs that we know to be beneficial. If the only people who are accessing those projects and diversion alternatives and detention alternatives are white youth, then you still aren't you're getting to the kind of potential that you want as a local task force. And so I just caution you to focus on those things, but also to some do's and don'ts. One of Frameworks Institute did a paper. They talk about ways to communicate messages more effectively. The organization does, and they did one about talking about race and racism, and they said the best way to make arguments are to avoid some of these pitfalls. One of them was, don't start conversations with historical legacy, and talking about structural roots, just using language that is sometimes very confusing for people, or they can just remove themselves from the conversation. So if you talk about historical legacy, easily people can just say, well, we're not like that. Our group is not doing the things that were done 50 years ago, so we don't see ourselves in that painful, harmful past. They can see themselves in a current structure that doesn't look at all like that and feel like they're doing the right thing. So, and don't lead your audience into talking about individual people, because you start to get into focusing on the triumphant individuals or the exceptions, and then you can start talking about the people who aren't falling into that ship. So once you start to talk about maybe sob stories or stories that you have anecdotally, and you focus too much on the individual, you start to think about individual bad actors that one can point out as being racist. And maybe if we didn't have a racist judge or we didn't have a racist probation officer, then maybe we could be in a better place. And we know that that's not going to work. One, because no one's going to do the work of trying to figure out who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, and that won't end well for anyone. But also because we know that there's no amount of bad guys that we can point to that we can point to as the contributing factor. They're all contributing factors. And so instead discuss fairness and how a fair system is best for everyone involved. And that if you have a system where everyone is paying attention to racial impact, paying attention to how their policies, how the policy and practice of a judge and a police officer directly impacts how a kid, the outcome of a kid in probation and aftercare, even though they are not making those decisions, a decision they made 3 steps before is going to impact the kid as they leave. And a social service agency or provider that is working on prevention before the kid even comes in contact with the system is making decisions that can affect whether an arrest happens, and making sure that people see themselves as a part of a bigger system, and each person is an active decision maker that has agency and has discretion. Then those conversations gives people a perspective that they can make change individually in each piece in whatever role they play in the process. And it's not dependent on you making just a case to who you think is the most important person in the room, but ensuring that you are responsible for your own, how your decisions play a role in everything else that is going on in the system. And just ensuring that what we are tasked with doing is intervening. And I think what this group is tasked with doing is making recommendations about interventions that are positive. And so I just think that hopefully after this meeting, you are looking at the data and starting with asking questions of the information, like you started to do, but reaching out to Susan or myself or anyone who you know to be responsible for giving you the information, and then being critical of it, focusing on a specific point or context or decision and figuring out where you see areas that you can make the most impact. And then doing an assessment. There's a whole DMC reduction model, but one of them is after you look at the data, you're responsible for asking what contributed to those numbers. So not getting overwhelmed with just the numbers on the page, but saying, if there were 300 arrests, how could we get to 250 by the next year? And start to ask, why are kids getting arrested? What are police tasked with doing that incentivizes this number of arrests? And start to do a local assessment. And I say don't skip this step, because a lot of people do the data and go straight to interventions, and they start to just brainstorm programs that they can do. If only I had funding, I would do this program for kids, and it will be the best program for kids that you've ever seen. But if you can't, at the end of the year, whatever your grant period is, say that the program you decided to really devote all your time to, if you can't connect it back to the data that propelled you to that space, then you can't really say that the program was a success or a failure. So the assessment piece allows you to ask the questions of what contributed to the data so that you attack the contributing factor and you don't attack just the number. And so if one of the contributing factors you say is it's just system professionals are the problem and they're not being trained correctly, then you can spend the whole year focusing on implementing trainings that are best practice. And you can say, hey, at the beginning of the year or 3-year process, police officers were trained in implicit bias and racial bias. And you can track year to year if the number of trainings and the number of hours of trainings or that training led to changes in behavior. Or if you think that's not the way to go because law enforcement's not on the same page as you, then you can go down to geography and focus your efforts on a particular zip code or a particular school in a school district that you have a relationship with. And if you can say you want to focus on detention and this many kids from this school are being detained for whatever reason because of a pull from a certain person, then you can use your relationships and the people at this table to attack the contributing factor and not just say, well, detention is an overwhelming thing and don't do anything about it kind of thing. So do a local assessment, take this information and use it as a jumping off point to ask the kinds of questions of yourself that I can't ask from Chicago because I don't know anyone here, but you guys can ask of your colleagues because they can be like, oh, I know such and such in the clerk's office and I can make sense of this information if I just talk to her or something like that. That's why we want to talk to juvenile justice councils and things like that, is because we know that when I call and I want to talk about race, I am not received well. But if you guys have that same conversation, you have a relationship that you can build on that we don't as a statewide body, and you can utilize those relationships and those networks to better address the issues that you call attention to. So my throat is dry. I've been talking a lot. Do you have any questions? I'm happy to send the notes from the Frameworks Institute about communicating about race and more information about how to address contributing factors to racial and ethnic disparities so that you can do a local assessment step by step and hopefully do an evaluation and stuff that further down the line. But if you need me as a resource, I'm happy to be available at any point. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions. Um, when you say don't talk about a historical past, I guess I don't understand what that means. Does that mean never? Are you saying don't lead with that? Or are you suggesting that, because, and then you couple it with fairness. So some people's sense of fairness is different from mine. And so if they feel like they're being fair by targeting African-American youth in order to create a safe community, then we're never going to have a conversation. We can't meet. So that, again, is and
Troubling.
again, don't talk about individual stories, but individual stories compile, make data.
Agreed.
So,
Yeah.
right, so.
So
that-
okay, sorry.
So
Go ahead.
that is contradictory to some people's reality. That, because it's also true then that we wouldn't perhaps be in this situation if there was fairness. We wouldn't even be here. We wouldn't have this conversation. We wouldn't have disproportionate an overrepresentation. So are you saying, so I need to know, is that the rule of thumb across the board? Because I grew up with the adages, if you don't use precise language, you're not talking about the real situation. So how can we not shy away from talking about racial disparity without talking, and yet not talk about the historical impact of racial disparity? Or just racial disparity isn't racism. Let's just call it what it is.
Yes.
Okay? Racial disparity, overrepresentation, blah. Again, we're skirting around what really is true and is fact, which is we live in a racist country. So what language, again, as you said, don't talk about the historical past, don't talk about individual stories, talk about fairness. And if people feel like they're being fair, what
Right.
else is there to talk about?
I think my suggestion, and I should have used an asterisk, a caveat. So the Frameworks Institute developed these kind of do's and don'ts based on focus groups that they've done with groups across the country around what turns people off from a discussion about race and racism. And that's where they created that list of don'ts. Myself, and that's why I started saying, I know that I'm very comfortable talking about race. And if I'm talking to someone else who's also very comfortable talking about race, I can use things like white privilege and systemic racism, and we can easily understand each other because of we have a common language. When there are groups from all sides of the spectrum in terms of what approach they have when they hear the term race, or they hear racism or white privilege, or they hear systemic racism, those, based on that data, show that those things instantly turn some people off from the conversation because they don't understand it, or they feel more defensive about that than other pieces of language. So it says they say don't start the conversation with historical race, talking about slavery or talking about Jim Crow or civil rights, because people can remove themselves more easily. That doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about it at all. It just means that when people start the conversation with those things, it more easily turns people off and they don't listen to the rest of what you have to say. So there's nothing about it, anything that I say or in the frameworks, that you should use as the rule of thumb, as in, if I don't follow these things, I shouldn't talk about it at all. I'm saying you should gauge who the group is that you're talking to, and make sure that you are using the language, at least introducing language that the whole group can understand, And if you think that they are prepared, or if you have prepared them to dive deeper into things like, we live in a racist country, we need to be honest about that, and that's how you want to start your conversation or start your paragraph in a report, then I recommend you do. And that's what I would want to do in most conversations. But I've also talked to groups of just law enforcement or just probation, and when they hear white privilege or they hear systemic racism, they instantly put their hands up and they say, well, I don't really believe in that term. I don't believe in the term that you're using. I don't believe in the direction you're going. And I don't think that as a cop that I'm racist because I'm doing, and then the whole conversation starts talking about, am I racist or not? And so the do's and don'ts that I was giving you was just things to keep in mind when you're approaching a topic that people universally, more often than not, don't want to do. They don't want to have the conversation. And in order to get people to the table, you may have to ease them into conversations that they don't want to have. And the way to ease them into it may be to do some of those things that you feel like they should be better prepared for, but they're just not. And so, yeah, don't talk about fairness and not say, when I say fairness, I'm talking about treating a black kid the same way that you would treat a white kid, or treating your kid the way that you treated that black kid today. That can be your conversation about fairness. It could also be, if you say what I'm doing is fair, then you should then bring the data into it. If a cop says, I think this is fair, I look at those numbers and I see fairness, that is your introduction to say, well, does it seem fair? Because as a woman of color, when I see these kind of percentages, I don't feel like that's a system that is fair to my kid, that's fair to my community. And that's an opening point to be like, well, why are you here and I'm here, and how do we get to a place where we look at the same data and we make the same determination of what parity looks like and what equity looks like that isn't based on if you're racist or not. And so that's why we use those terms that everybody at least knows the baseline for fair, and then you can then start to tackle why it is they came to the table with that definition that looks so different than yours.
Okay.
And also, don't take anything I say as the only way that you should live your life,
Oh,
because
no,
I
not
don't.
the only way. I'm probably like you. I just have zero tolerance for
Right.
for denial and lies. I just
Right.
have
So my
no
cynicism is really
tolerance.
high, and outside of this microphone, we can definitely get into all sorts of reasons why I'm just all the way fed up. But if you were tasked with a project that you need to do, and you feel like
right.
the way to get to your solution is not to start it with, I'm completely fed up with how behind the times you are, then then you could put that aside for the moment and have some better discussions.
Thank you so much. I mean, you guys,
thank all of you,
Karima
yeah.
came down on the train today from Chicago and is staying over to be here for this. And so just appreciate your time and expertise and everything. Yes, love the scenery here in this room. So what do we do about the rest of the agenda?
I don't know, but I'm going home.
Do we
Okay,
have
so we have-
possible people that wanted to speak? I
They
see
already asked them. They said no.
Okay.
Say hi to Susan's boss and his wife. So Peter is the director of the Center for Prevention and Research Development at U of I, and which is a great resource for all things.
Susan, you did a lovely job tonight.
Yes, Susan, give her a raise, right? All right, thanks for movement to adjourn from Esther. And Amy, if people will take a look at what Amy sent out and provide her direct feedback, or go to her house as she's offered so many times and help support her in this, and bring food and drink to,
Can we bring scissors, Amy?
to cut. And we'll put it on the agenda for next meeting. Is that cool, Amy? All right, thanks, everyone. Have a great night.